She believed she had him trapped, backing him into a corner with relentless questions, each one aimed at chipping away at his credibility. But she underestimated him. Just when she thought she had the upper hand, he flipped the script, revealing her bias in real time. The bright studio lights of the Los Angeles Broadcasting Center glinted off the glass table as the cameras glided across the packed room. Industry giants, seasoned reporters, and lucky spectators who had managed to snag a seat for the evening show sat in anticipation. Tonight on the Samantha Blake Show, the guest was none other than Jamal Harrison, CEO of Sentinel Dynamics, a tech empire making waves. At only 42, Jamal had built a billion-dollar empire from scratch. What had begun as a small startup had now become one of the most influential tech firms in Silicon Valley, dominating artificial intelligence and cybersecurity. But Jamal's journey wasn't just about innovation, it was about perseverance. He had carved his way through an industry that wasn't always welcoming to leaders who looked like him. Yet if he had come to this interview expecting a straightforward conversation, he was in for a rude awakening. Samantha Blake wasn't just any journalist. A veteran in the field, she had built her career on sharp, unyielding questioning. To some, she was a beacon of fearless journalism. To others, she was ruthless, even verging on unethical when it suited her. As the final countdown appeared on the studio monitors, Jamal adjusted his blazer and inhaled deeply. He had faced skeptical investors, dismissive competitors, and media narratives that often refused to credit his brilliance. But this was different. This was live television. The red light on the camera flashed on. The show had begun. "Welcome back to the Samantha Blake Show," Samantha announced, her voice smooth, yet charged with underlying intensity. "Tonight we have a guest who has been called a visionary, a disruptor, and, dare I say, controversial. Please welcome the CEO of Sentinel Dynamics, Mr. Jamal Harrison." Applause filled the studio as Jamal acknowledged the crowd with a polite nod before shaking Samantha's hand firmly. Her smile was bright, polished, professional, but there was something else lurking beneath it. An agenda. "Jamal, it's a pleasure to have you here," she said, her tone laced with calculated warmth. "Thanks for having me, Samantha," he replied evenly. "I'm looking forward to our discussion." Her fingers skimmed through her notes before she settled her gaze on him. "Let's start with something simple," she said, her tone deceptively casual. "You've built an empire in the tech industry. Sentinel Dynamics is now valued at over $80 billion. But many people are wondering, how does someone like you break into a world dominated by legacy players?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. "Someone like you." Jamal didn't blink. His expression remained unreadable as he responded, his voice steady. "Success in tech isn't about legacy," he said. "It's about innovation. If you build something that solves a real problem, people take notice." Samantha leaned forward slightly, her posture tightening. "So you're saying it had nothing to do with strategic diversity hires? No one opened doors for you because it looked good on paper?" A murmur rippled through the audience. Jamal's jaw tightened for the briefest second, but he kept his voice calm, measured. "I believe my work speaks for itself," he said. "We've developed technology trusted by government agencies, Fortune 500 companies, and millions of consumers worldwide. No one hands you that level of responsibility as a token." Samantha let out a short laugh, shaking her head as if she had caught him dodging the truth. "Come on, Jamal. Even you have to admit there are certain advantages in today's climate." And just like that, the game had begun. Jamal let the silence stretch, the weight of her words pressing down on the room. The audience shifted, sensing the shift in power. Then a small smile ghosted across his lips, calm, unreadable. He leaned forward, his voice controlled but deliberate. "Samantha," he said, "do you honestly believe that a company like Sentinel Dynamics, one that's responsible for securing critical infrastructure, working with the Department of Defense and handling multi-billion-dollar contracts would put someone in charge just to check a box? A flicker of something flashed across Samantha's face, too quick to catch, but it was there. "I'm not saying that," she countered, her voice losing just a fraction of its earlier confidence. "I'm just pointing out that the tech industry is pushing for more inclusivity. Some might argue that plays a role in hiring and investment decisions." Jamal gave a slow nod, his gaze unwavering. "Inclusivity is important," he acknowledged, "but at the end of the day, no investor, no government agency, and no customer will trust a product that doesn't work." Sentinel Dynamics didn't become what it is because someone wanted to meet a diversity quota. It became what it is because we built something better than anyone else. A hushed murmur rippled through the audience. Samantha held her ground, but something in her posture shifted. A stiffness, a hesitation. The balance of power had shifted, and for the first time that evening, she wasn't the one controlling the narrative. She flipped to a fresh page in her notes, the paper crisp beneath her fingers. "Let's talk about your background," she said, her tone shifting, recalibrating. She was switching gears, but Jamal could already see where this was going. "You didn't come from the same circles as most Silicon Valley elites," she continued, her eyes flicking up from her notes. "No Ivy League degree, no family ties in tech." SEA calculated pause. "You grew up in Baltimore, right?" Jamal nodded once. "That's right. Born and raised." "And your parents," she pressed on, her voice deliberately even. "Your father was a mechanic, your mother a school teacher, correct?" Jamal felt the rhythm of the conversation slowing, stretching. He knew this tactic well, dissecting his origins, framing his success as an anomaly rather than an inevitability. Samantha tapped her pen against the clipboard, her gaze steady. "Let's be honest," she said, her voice adopting that familiar journalistic mix of curiosity and doubt. "It's rare for someone with your background to end up where you are today. Some would say you beat the odds." Jamal exhaled through his nose, the corners of his jaw tightening. He knew exactly what this was, the carefully constructed setup, the leading narrative. But he had faced this before. "I worked hard," he said simply, "but I also had great mentors, great teachers, people who recognized my potential and gave me opportunities to prove myself." Samantha arched an eyebrow, her expression shifting ever so slightly. "And yet," she said, "some would argue those opportunities aren't available to everyone. That someone with your exact background, same intelligence, same work ethic, might not have made it because of systemic barriers." The air in the studio grew dense, charged. Jamal tilted his head slightly, considering his words before delivering them with measured precision. "Are you asking me if systemic barriers exist?" His voice was calm, but the weight behind it was undeniable. "Of course they do, but I don't believe in using them as an excuse not to try." Samantha leaned in just a fraction, her voice cooling, sharpening. "That almost sounds like you're saying people should just work harder and ignore the reality of discrimination." Jamal let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "No," he corrected, his tone firm but unshaken. "I'm saying that success isn't about ignoring reality. It's about pushing through it. I understood the world wasn't fair when I was 12 years old, but I didn't wait for it to change before I started moving." A smattering of applause broke out in the audience, brief but telling. Samantha's lips pressed together, just for a moment. A flicker of something unreadable crossed her face before she quickly adjusted, flipping through her notes again. She wasn't done. "All right," she said, her voice lightening, shifting tactics. "Let's talk about your company's hiring practices." She glanced down at her clipboard. "Sentinel Dynamics has been praised for its diversity initiatives. Some say that's played a major role in your success, that you've positioned yourself as an inclusive company at a time when that's an incredibly marketable advantage. Jamal's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened. "Samantha," he said smoothly, "do you know how many of our top engineers have PhDs from MIT, Stanford, or Caltech?" She blinked, caught slightly off guard. "I, 86%, he answered for her. "Do you know how many of our executive board members previously worked at Fortune 500 companies?" A brief hesitation. "I, 72%. Jamal leaned forward slightly, his voice unwavering. "So tell me, Samantha, at what point does that start sounding like hiring for optics?" The room fell still, the weight of his words settling over the studio like a thick fog. Samantha's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around her clipboard. She wasn't used to losing control of the conversation, especially not this early in an interview. But she recovered quickly, letting out a small, airy chuckle. "Well, Jamal," she said, flipping to a new page, "I'm just playing devil's advocate here. I think it's a fair question, don't you?" Jamal leaned back slightly, studying her. "It's fair if it's asked across the board," he replied, his voice deliberate. "Do you ask every CEO if their success is due to diversity initiatives, or just the ones who look like me?" A murmur rolled through the audience, a low but unmistakable reaction. Samantha held her neutral expression, but something in her shoulders shifted ever so slightly. She cleared her throat. "Let's move on." Jamal allowed himself a small smile. He had expected her to pivot. "Your company is at the forefront of AI security," she continued, regaining her footing. "But there's been controversy. Some critics are raising concerns about privacy risks, particularly with your contracts involving law enforcement. How do you respond to accusations that Sentinel Dynamics is contributing to surveillance overreach?" Now that was a real question, a conversation worth having. Jamal nodded. "We take privacy very seriously," he said, his tone shifting into one of firm authority. "Our technology is built with transparency at its core. Unlike some competitors, we've set strict ethical guidelines. We don't sell data, we don't enable warrantless surveillance, and we don't work with agencies that violate civil rights." Samantha tilted her head. "That sounds good in theory," she said, "but let's be honest. Once technology is out there, companies can't always control how it's used." Jamal nodded. "You're right, which is why we build safeguards. Every contract we sign includes oversight requirements. If a client misuses our technology, we have the right to terminate agreements." He met her gaze directly. "And we have, more than once." She arched a brow. "So you're saying you hold law enforcement accountable?" "Absolutely," Jamal said without hesitation. "That's exactly why I started this company." For the first time, Samantha seemed slightly off balance. She had expected defensiveness, maybe even a stumble. Instead, she found herself up against a man who was too prepared, too steady. So she shifted gears again. "Speaking of responsibility," she said, her voice taking on an edge, "let's talk about your leadership. There have been whispers, former employees claiming you're overly demanding, that you run Sentinel like a dictatorship. What do you say to those allegations?" Jamal's jaw tightened slightly. "Uh-huh. So now we're going there." "I expect excellence," he said, his tone controlled. "Sentinel Dynamics isn't a startup in a garage. We handle critical infrastructure. We don't get second chances. If that makes me demanding, then I'll own that." Samantha let out a small laugh, tilting her head. "That's a very polished answer," she said. "But do you think some of the criticism comes from employees who feel intimidated by you?" Jamal's expression didn't change, but his voice cooled. "You mean because I hold them to a high standard? Or because of something else?" The room went silent. Samantha hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. In that moment, she realized she had walked straight into it. Jamal didn't break eye contact. "I've noticed something, Samantha," he said slowly. When CEOs like Elon Musk or Steve Jobs are called demanding, they're visionaries. But when someone like me is demanding, it's intimidation. A ripple of murmurs swept through the audience. Samantha sat back slightly, recalibrating. That's not what I meant. Jamal's lips twitched. Isn't it? The balance had shifted, and for the first time, Samantha Blake was no longer the one leading the conversation. Jamal's voice was steady, calm, yet undeniably firm. Let's talk about what actually matters. His gaze remained unwavering. Sentinel Dynamics employs over 12,000 people across the country. We've revolutionized cybersecurity, stopping breaches that would have cost companies billions. Our AI systems safeguard hospitals, power grids, critical infrastructure that keeps people safe. We're one of the few tech companies that turned a profit within our first 5 years. And yet, this entire conversation has been about whether I belong rather than the work I've done. Samantha parted her lips to respond, but Jamal lifted a hand, a subtle yet unmistakable signal that he wasn't finished. So tell me, Samantha. His voice remained even, but the weight of his words filled the space between them. If I looked different, if my background were different, would we still be having this conversation? Silence stretched thick in the air, pressing down on the studio like an unspoken truth that refused to be ignored. The audience knew the answer. The viewers at home knew the answer. And most importantly, so did Samantha. A flicker of something, discomfort, hesitation, passed through her expression. She forced a quick laugh, but it was thinner now, brittle at the edges. Jamal, I think you're reading too much into this. I was just playing devil's advocate. Jamal tilted his head, his expression unreadable. Why is it always the devil that needs an advocate? A few scattered gasps rippled through the audience, a sharp intake of breath, a hushed "oh" from somewhere in the back. For the briefest moment, Samantha's polished exterior cracked, her face frozen in a fraction of hesitation. Jamal leaned back in his chair, exhaling softly. You want a headline, Samantha? Here's one. CEO discusses his company instead of justifying his existence. A beat of silence, then applause, hesitant at first, then gaining momentum, growing into something impossible to ignore. Some members of the audience rose to their feet, others clapped cautiously before joining in. The energy in the room had shifted. Samantha darted a glance at her producers. She had walked into this interview thinking she controlled the narrative, but now the ground was shifting beneath her. And Jamal? He wasn't playing her game anymore. The applause only grew louder. A standing ovation was rare this early in an interview segment, but there was no mistaking what had just unfolded. Samantha tightened her grip on her pen, trying to regain control. She forced another smile, her voice strained. Well, that was certainly passionate, she said, her laugh thinner than before. But I do think we should move on. A voice from the audience cut through. Answer the question. The entire room turned toward the speaker, a man older, sitting in the third row. He wasn't angry. If anything, his expression was one of curiosity, laced with quiet amusement. He leaned forward slightly. Would you be asking him the same things if he were someone else? Samantha stiffened. Sir, we have a format to follow. Another voice, a woman younger, sitting closer to the stage. He's right, she said, her voice firm. Why focus so much on how he got here instead of what he's actually done? A murmur spread through the crowd, voices rising in agreement. Samantha's fingers curled slightly around her clipboard. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. Jamal remained quiet, watching, waiting. He could feel it. The way the energy in the room had shifted, the way the audience was no longer seeing this as just another interview. Samantha cleared her throat, straightening. I ask tough questions to all my guests. That's my job. Jamal nodded. Fair enough, he said. Then let's go back through your last 5 interviews with other tech CEOs. How many of them did you ask if they were diversity hires? Silence. Samantha blinked once, then twice. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. The audience wasn't looking at Jamal anymore. They were looking at her. Let's be real, Jamal continued, his voice calm, steady. That question wasn't about transparency. It was about something else. People like me, no matter how much we achieve, are always expected to justify why we belong. Samantha forced another tight smile. Well, Jamal, I think we've covered that. Topic enough. Jamal exhaled softly. I agree. A pause. Let's talk about my actual work now. Laughter rippled through the audience. Not just amusement, but approval. Samantha had no choice but to move on. She flipped through her notes, but her confidence had faltered. She had lost control of the interview. And the real shift? It was happening outside the walls of the studio. By the time the interview wrapped, Jamal stepped off the stage, shaking hands with the producers, making his way to the green room. But already the energy in the air was undeniable. Back on set, Samantha kept her usual polished composure. But for those paying attention, the difference was clear. She delivered a carefully crafted closing statement, but the damage had been done. The narrative was no longer hers to control. And outside of that studio, the world was watching. Within minutes, the clip began circulating. At first, it was just a few posts on Twitter. Short captions. Jamal Harrison just gave the most powerful interview of the year. Watch how he dismantles bias in real time. Then it spread. News outlets picked it up. Podcasts debated it. Talk shows replayed it. By the time Jamal was in his car, heading back to his office, his phone wouldn't stop vibrating. Texts from colleagues, missed calls from journalists, a flood of emails, supporters, strangers, industry leaders. At 10:17 p.m., Sentinel Dynamics' official website crashed from the surge in traffic. By 11:42, a prominent news anchor tweeted, "This isn't just about one interview. It's about how we view leadership in America." By morning, hashtags were trending. Chaka Jamal Harrison speaks. The question that changed. Everything high-profile figures weighed in. A former senator tweeted, "Brilliant." He exposed the bias without ever raising his voice. A well-known journalist admitted, "I've done hundreds of interviews." That moment, that was a masterclass in control. Of course, not everyone celebrated. Some accused Jamal of being defensive, of orchestrating calculated outrage. Others defended Samantha, insisting she was just doing her job. But the overwhelming response, Jamal had ignited a conversation that couldn't be ignored. Days later, an opinion piece in a major publication put it plainly. The issue isn't whether Samantha Blake meant harm. The issue is that every successful Black leader has been asked some version of that question. Jamal Harrison didn't just answer for himself. He answered for every person who's ever had to prove they belong in a space they already earned. Samantha remained silent. Her network, sensing the shift, carefully avoided the topic. And Jamal, he wasn't concerned with the controversy. He was focused on the impact. Sitting in his office, he watched the clip play on his laptop. He had seen it a dozen times, not for vanity, but to understand the moment. What made it different? It wasn't the confrontation. He had faced worse. It wasn't the question itself. He had heard it before. It was the response. For the first time, people were listening. His phone buzzed. Another journalist requesting an interview. Another executive offering support. But the messages that stood out most, the ones from young professionals, students, employees who had sat in boardrooms, heard those same doubts, swallowed their responses. You said what I never had the chance to say. Jamal leaned back, exhaling slowly. This wasn't about him anymore. He picked up his phone, typed out a response. I appreciate the interest, but I don't need another interview. The work I do every day, that's my statement. He pressed send. Because in the end, real impact wasn't a viral moment. It was building something that no one could ignore.